Old Testament Survey, Lesson 10. We are going to finish the life of Jacob and take a look at Joseph and Judah and how the children of Israel managed to get themselves stranded, as it were, in the land of Egypt today. So let's begin with a quick glance at Judah's family in Genesis 37. Actually, before we do that, chapter 36, we will revisit this topic after we finish Genesis when we get into the book of Job. But Genesis 36 records not only the genealogy of Esau, the people known as the Edomites, Esau's children, but it also has a king's list that begins in verse 31 of chapter 36 and goes down to 40. A common ancient theory is that Jobab, the son of Zerah of Bozrah, in verse 33, and Bela died, and Jobab, the son of Zerah of Bozrah, reigned in his stead. Common ancient theory, which I think is likely true, is that this Jobab, king of the Edomites, is Job of the book of Job. So make note in the margin of your Bible, if you like, or make note in your notebook. We will be talking about that verse when we get into Job in a few weeks. That said, let's take a quick glance at Genesis 37. Genesis 37 begins to show us the journey of Judah, who is the chosen seed through which the dynasty of Messiah will be established in David, and the Messiah will come when Jesus is born to Mary, the wife of Joseph. So Judas's family history begins with a shameful incident of him producing offspring with his daughter-in-law after the death of her husband, but one of their sons becomes the ancestor of David and Jesus. That's chapter 38. But actually, Judah's problems start earlier, right? When you look at Genesis 37, I assume all of you have your Bibles open in front of you. But when you look at Genesis 37, you're going to notice something really interesting in Genesis 37. You're going to notice that Judah is going to take a leadership role in the plot against Joseph. Joseph, of course, at 17 years old, is the favorite of his father. He is given the coat of many colors, which is symbolically identifying him as the heir. Remember, colors were expensive, and it was far more common to wear a coat that was the color of whatever animal it was taken from. If it was wool from a sheep, if it was a black sheep, it would be black wool. If it was a white sheep, it would be white wool. To dye the colors was expensive and time-consuming. So this was a mark of distinction. His father was saying, "This is my heir." Okay. Joseph, of course, then has the dream in which he sees his brothers and his parents symbolically bowing before him, though it seems at first that he may not understand the dream. Verse 7 says, "For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaf stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf." And of course, the brothers become angry, and he says to them, "Will you then rule over us?" And then he dreamed another dream. And you would think after the first response he got, he wouldn't talk about the second one. But in his second dream, it says in verse 9, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me." And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? Wow. Joseph is becoming very popular in the family these days, right? So not only does he expect that he's going to rule over his brothers, but also he expects that he's going to rule over his mother and father. Do you understand why that was irksome? Yeah, see heads nodding? At the same time, though, in our culture, we would say, well, that was a weird dream. Whatever you ate at dinner, don't eat so much of it next time. But in their culture, a dream that you remembered was always thought to have meaning, right? And in this case, they were right. Joseph's dreams were prophetic about what was going to happen later in their family story. So Joseph is later sent by his father to go and check on his brethren who are in the field with the flocks. So he sent Joseph, verse 14 and 15, he sent Joseph to the Vale of Hebron, and he came to the community of Shechem. And it says, a certain man found him and wait a minute, am I in the right place? Yeah, I am. Okay. And it says that a certain man found him, and he asked him, saying, What seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, They are departed hence, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now therefore, and let us slay him and cast him into some pit, and we will say some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. So, there's a plot. The implication that you get at first is all the brothers are in on the plot, right? But that's not accurate. Because as we read on, verse 21 says, Reuben heard it, and he delivered them out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. So Reuben is the one, the actual firstborn, who wants to deliver the father's favorite, the firstborn of Jacob and Rachel, but not his actual firstborn. What does it say to you about the character of Reuben, that he, the son who it would seem had the most to gain by the death of Joseph, wanted to return him to his father safely, while the other brothers were conspiring? And I would say probably talking about 9 other brothers, right? Because Benjamin is not there. Lauren, I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. You don't appear to be muted. Can anyone else? Can everyone else hear Lauren? You can? That might be my problem then. Give me just a second. Okay, Lauren, talk again. Lauren? Very good. Now, you all know the story, right? They decide to throw him in the pit and they sit down to eat. We don't know where Reuben goes, but they notice some people coming. It's a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery, verse 25, and balm and myrrh going to carry it down to Egypt. Now, they probably didn't actually see what was in the packs on the camel at the time that they spotted the Ishmaelites, right? That it probably just means that when they approached the Ishmaelites and they saw what they were carrying, that's how they knew what it was. Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brethren were content. Okay? Judah is the actual chosen seed. Reuben is the actual firstborn. Joseph is daddy's favorite. This is a really odd series of events because you see two older brothers show some leadership in this situation. Reuben, who's trying to rescue Joseph, and Judah, who wants to make a profit off of Joseph. Now, verse 28 presents a challenge. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph also to Egypt. So who sold Joseph? Did his brothers sell him, or did the Midianites sell him? By the way, did you notice that Joseph and his brothers are interacting with cousins? These are children of Ishmael and children of Midian, one of Abraham's sons through Keturah, right? So their cousins happen by, and so was it the Midianites who sold Joseph into slavery? Or was it the Ishmaelites? Or was it the Israelites? Was it the Midianites who said, hey, let's pick this guy up who's sitting in this hole and let's sell him to these guys? Or was it the Ishmaelites who bought him from his brothers? And just in case that wasn't confusing enough, look what it says in verse 36. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. Well, wait a minute. It says in verse 28, the Midianites drew him and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. But now it says the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar. So, who sold Joseph into slavery? I'm asking you. Sort this out for me. Yep. And then what happened in 28? You understand why this is an interesting passage that creates a lot of controversy? This is one of those passages in the Old Testament that cause people to say, maybe this is actually just a piecing together of different manuscripts that were actually written at different times. I don't think that that's necessary to unravel this. Remember, the Ishmaelites and the Midianites were sons of Abraham. And it says that the Midianites were merchantmen, and it says that the Ishmaelites were bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt, which means they were also merchantmen. I don't think this is actually two groups. The Midianites were also present in Egypt in verse 36 to sell Joseph to Potiphar. I think this is actually two groups. The Midianites are working with or for the Ishmaelites. So what happens is they see the Ishmaelite band coming, they make the deal, and in verse 28, the Midianites, who are working with or for the Ishmaelites, draw Joseph out of the pit and make the transaction to sell him to the Ishmaelites. Okay? But they are traveling with the Ishmaelites into Egypt, where the Midianites sell Joseph to Potiphar. Here's what I see. The Midianites are acting as the agents of the Ishmaelites in both transactions. It may very well be that the Ishmaelites won't talk to Israelites, right? Kind of like a Jew-Samaritan thing. Don't talk to me, talk to my Midianite servant. Yeah. Agreed. Another interesting thing, 20 pieces of silver. At the time of Moses, that was not the price of a slave. But at the time of Joseph, it was. So that's an interesting historical note, right? Moses happened to know what the price of a slave was somewhere between 215 and 350 something years earlier. Fascinating. Moses must have been well read. Okay, then chapter 38 brings us to the shame of Judah. And you probably know the story, but we'll review it. Judah has a son, and Judah decides he's going to get his son married off, right? And Judah is going through the motions, if you will, of traveling back and forth with his brothers to take care of sheep. And look what it says in chapter 38, verse 1. Came to pass at that time that Judah went down from the brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and went in unto her, and she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. Now, do you get the idea that this relationship must be something of an ongoing thing? And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah, and he was at Kezib when she bare him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan, Go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. And Onan knew that the seed should not be his. And it came to pass, when he went in unto his brother's wife, that he spilled it on the ground, lest he should give seed to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. Then said Judah to Tamar his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, Lest peradventure he die also. as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So Tamar is waiting around for her husband. He grows up, and he is not given to her to husband. So she realizes that she's going to die an old spinster without any kids. So she sets a trap for her father-in-law by dressing up as a harlot, knowing that he seems to have a predilection for, finding women when he's traveling. And he comes to her, asks what the going rate is. He makes a pledge, gives her his bracelets. They have intercourse together, and lo and behold, his daughter-in-law turns up pregnant a short time later. He's going to have her killed until he is shown the signet and the bracelets from his own hands, and he knows he's caught. So what does he do? Well, he does what he had to do. He had to accept that the child was hers and the child was his. But that child is going to become important to the story of the promised seed. Okay? That child is going to become important because this woman, Tamar, is part of the ancestry of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. Okay? And it seems as though that's kind of an aside to Joseph's story, but I actually think if you look at the biblical narrative and how it follows the storyline of the promised seed, this isn't Joseph's story. Joseph is a character in Judah's story. So let's go back then. Judah's family history begins with a shameful incident of him producing offspring with his daughter-in-law after the death of her husband, but one of their sons becomes the ancestor of David and Jesus. And then we come to the place where the Israelites all go to Egypt. Jacob died in the land of Egypt at 147 years old, having been in Egypt for 17 years. Genesis 47:27. He came to Egypt at 130 years old in the second year of the famine, following 7 years of plenty. Thus, when his son Joseph stood before Pharaoh to interpret the dream, Joseph being 30, Jacob was 121 years old, which means that Joseph was born when Jacob was 91 years old. Joseph was born in Haran before the return to the Promised Land. Since Jacob was in Haran 20 years, he was 71 or slightly older at the time he fled from Isaac's house from his older brother. Jacob and Esau were 120 years old when their father died. 10 years after the death of Isaac, Jacob left the Promised Land for the last time, and only his remains have ever returned to be buried in the tomb of the patriarchs so far. And then, with chapter 39, begins the drama of Joseph and Judah. And I like to refer to this section of scripture in Genesis 39 through 46 as the pneumatology section of Genesis. Does anyone remember what the meaning of pneumatology is? You Greek students, pneuma, spirit. Pneumatology is the study of God the Holy Spirit. Okay? So in your systematic theology class in your 5th year, one of the subjects you will study is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. That's pneumatology. So here we are then in chapter 39. Joseph in Egypt rises to prominence in the house of his master, Potiphar, the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, and is falsely accused of attempting to assault his wife after he refuses to lie with her carnally and is cast into prison, where he rises to become the steward of the prison. So go back to Genesis 37 for a moment and read verse 36 again. And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. So what is what is Potiphar's position with Pharaoh? He's the captain of the guard, right? Okay. Chapter 39 tells the story of how Joseph rose to the level of being essentially the steward of the house of Potiphar. And verse 20, after his mistress, the master's wife, had made a false accusation against him, verse 20 says, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Interesting. But what's even more interesting is where they had to go to get Joseph out of prison later. But we'll get to that. Chapter 40, Joseph interprets the dreams of the chief butler and the chief baker, but the chief candlestick maker didn't have any dreams. Who were in the prison? Pharaoh's just kind of a guy with a bad temper, right? He throws his butler into prison. He throws his baker into prison. But Joseph interprets these dreams. Let's take a quick look at what the dreams were. They tell Joseph they're sad. He asks them why they're sad. They say they had these dreams. Joseph says, tell me what they were. Verse 9, the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossom shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in his hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up his head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. But think on me, when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. And he tells him the story of how he was stolen and wrongly put in the dungeon. Then the chief baker says, well, I also had a dream. I had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket was all the foods that the Pharaoh likes, but the birds ate all of the baskets on my head. And Joseph said, oh, well, that's also 3 days, and in 3 days, you're going to die because Pharaoh's going to take your head. Happy, happy birthday. And it came to pass, the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he made a feast unto all, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants, and he restored the chief butler his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. Thanks for the interpretation, Joe, but if you'll excuse me now, I have my life to get back to. Man, Joseph can't catch a break. So understand, Joseph now sits in prison another 2 full years. He's 30 by the time he gets to Pharaoh. That means he was in the house of Pharaoh and in prison for 11 years, the house of Potiphar and in prison for 11 years before he even got to the place where the butler abandons him and forgets him. And then 2 more years of waiting. And then Pharaoh has a dream. And it's about the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows standing by the brink of the river. And then he has the dream says that the ill-favored cows ate the well-favored cows. And then he had another dream. 7 ears of corn came up on one stalk, rank and good. Then 7 thin ears, blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. Then the 7 thin ears lean over and eat the fat corn. Behold, it was a dream. Yes, it was. Now, what's interesting to me about this, that I think can be easily overlooked by us Westerners, is he can't possibly mean corn like corn on the cob. He can't possibly. Can anyone tell me why? Because maize corn is indigenous to the Americas. Until we met the Indians, we'd never seen it. This corn is what they called corn in the old world, wheat. You will find that in the writings of the Pilgrims, they will talk about corn and Indian corn. Indian corn is what we call corn today. Corn was wheat. So I want you to imagine a stalk of wheat leaning over and eating a bigger stalk of wheat. That's the dream that Pharaoh woke up from and was troubled. Okay? And he was troubled all the next day. And the wise men couldn't figure it out. And he got mad at them. And then the butler remembered. And he says in verse 12, and there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams, to each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was, me he restored into mine office, and him he hanged. So Pharaoh calls Joseph, and he says, tell me the dream. And Joseph is told what the dream is by Pharaoh in verse 18 and verse 19 and verse 20 and verse 21. And verse 23, 24, 25, Joseph there in verse 25 begins to interpret. And he tells him there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Okay? But notice it says then, Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself. Right? Interesting. But where was the dungeon? The butler tells us in verse 10 where the dungeon was. Have you ever noticed it? Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. Who is the captain of the guard of Pharaoh? Potiphar. The dungeon was in Potiphar's house, or probably beneath it, right? So Joseph didn't really go anywhere except downstairs. And under the keeper of the prison, a servant of Potiphar, he was allowed to run the prison. Do you think that happened without Potiphar's knowledge? My answer is no. I think Potiphar knew that Joseph was a righteous man, a loyal man, a good man, and his wife was making stuff up. Because let's be candid. When you're married to a loose woman who tells lies, you know you're married to a loose woman who tells lies. Don't ask me how I know that. I will only say my wife is an angel. But my point is, he knows. Yeah, he sent Joseph down to the prison, but he also let Joseph run the prison, right? Because Potiphar is smart enough to know you don't waste talent. I said all that to say this. It's the little things, guys. Pay close attention to the details, and it's amazing sometimes the stuff you'll pick up. So Pharaoh then says something interesting after the dream is interpreted. And Pharaoh looks around the room in verse 33 because Joseph tells him to. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land and take up the fifth part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is a man in whom the Spirit of God is? That's strange talk for an Egyptian, isn't it? And do you remember what the butler said about Joseph? He's a young man and Hebrew. Now, why in the world would it make any difference to the king, certainly in a positive way, of Egypt, that Joseph was a Hebrew? Which raises the question, what Pharaoh of ancient Egypt did Joseph stand before? Has anyone ever looked into that? Sure, Lauren has, because mysteries, biblical and historical mysteries, are his passion. Kevin, Gilbert, Jr., Josh, have you ever thought about, if you go back and look at ancient history, which dynasty of the pharaohs are we in, and which pharaoh could this be? And are there any clues in this passage that might point the way? Well, to answer that question, you're going to need some basic information. While Lauren is Googling the answer, I'm just teasing Lauren. I will give you some guideposts, okay? We know from the book of 1 Kings, chapter 6, that according to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew copied by the Masoretes between 600 AD and 1000 AD, it was 480 years from the Exodus to the laying the foundation of the temple by Solomon. According to the Septuagint, it's 440 years. Okay? So there's a difference there of 40 years. So did the Exodus happen in 1406 or 1446? You can have different opinions. It's not relevant to my point. 1406 is the latest the Exodus could have happened. 1446 is the earliest. Okay? Now, that said, how long were the Israelites in Egypt? According to the Masoretic text in Exodus, they were in Egypt 430 years, but according to the Septuagint, it was in Canaan and Egypt, and there seems to be evidence in the New Testament that Paul favored the Septuagint timeline when he quoted that, saying Canaan and Egypt. And Flavius Josephus, a non-inspired Jewish historian in the 1st century, also agreed with the Septuagint. So we have these two possible differences in dates, right? Was it 215 years or 430 years? Or, as I think is more likely, was it less than 430 years, but possibly more than 215? The point is, when you put those dates together, you get a range. The earliest that Joseph could have entered Egypt is 1889 BC. The latest he could have entered Egypt is 1634 BC. So based on that information, are there a group of pharaohs or a specific pharaoh in that timeline that would seem to make the most sense based on the information in the passage? I give you the 15th dynasty of Egypt, the Hyksos. And I'm going to bring up Wikipedia's list of the pharaohs, not because I think Wikipedia is always a reliable source, but because they have convenient things like a table of the pharaohs of Egypt. Here's the 15th dynasty. The Hyksos people who emerged from the Fertile Crescent, the Fertile Crescent, by the way, is the area from Syria down into Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. Okay? Fertile Crescent, to establish a short-lived governance over much of the Nile region and ruled from 1674 to 1535 BC. Okay? Other sources, the modified chronology would say 1638 to 1530 BC. But you have roughly a time period where the Lower Egypt is ruled by Semitic peoples, not by Egyptians. For approximately 150 years, give or take, 130 to 150 years, these Semitic peoples are ruling Egypt. We also know that Joseph lived to be 110 and that he stood before Pharaoh at 30 years old, which means, scholars, he was in Egypt after this date for 80 years. He stood before Pharaoh, and for 80 years he was either in the court of the Pharaoh or, if retired, a highly respected officer. And you remember, it says specifically that the Israelites were enslaved in Exodus 1 by a Pharaoh that rose up who knew not Joseph. Well, the Hyksos line comes to an end somewhere between 1530 and, what does it say up here? 1535. And then come let me get down to it. Then come there's so many overlapping pharaohs. Here it is. The 18th dynasty, which began at the end of the Hyksos reign around 1550 to 1525. And these guys threw out the Hyksos. These guys kicked the Hyksos out of the country. And Amos the first became Nebtiri. Nebtiri, the first king of the post-Hyksos who ruled over Lower Egypt. Here's what I think happened. Somewhere up here in the 15th dynasty, around 1650 BC, the Hyksos invaded Semitic peoples, relatives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they came down, and we don't know the exact lengths of the early kings, but what we do know is this is the time period. It is, if you take If you take 1406 and add 215 years, you get 1621. If you take 1446 and you add 215 years, you get 1661. The date, don't lose me here, the date that Joseph stood before Pharaoh is somewhere either 1621 or 1661, if the Israelites were in Egypt only 215 years, which I don't necessarily think it's credible that it was only 215 years, but I can prove mathematically, and I will when we get to Exodus, that it wasn't 430. Okay? So that said, is it possible that somewhere in here, in this 15th dynasty, when Semites are ruling Egypt, the Hyksos, that's when Joseph comes into the court of Pharaoh, and the butler identifies him as a Hebrew, a Semite, and Pharaoh says to his courtiers, his fellow Semites, where in all of Egypt are we going to find a man like this? Remember, ancient peoples were nationalists, they were ethnists, and they were racists, right? Everybody's people was always the best people. And by the way, that's still true of most of the world today, right? I mean, people around the world are far more racist than we'd like them to be, far more elitist, far more ethnist, far more nationalist. And I think it makes the most sense that the Egyptian rulers known as the Hyksos, who were actually Semites from Mesopotamia or Syria, were in power when Joseph became the vizier or second in command of Pharaoh. I can't give you a specific Pharaoh, but I suspect, based on the timing, that it was probably one of the earlier ones whose exact range of time is unknown or even not suspected. So, that's my theory, and I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves and feel free to make a counter argument or ask questions. Yes, the Egyptians and the Semites in the Levant and the Fertile Crescent were all polytheistic, with the exception of Abraham and a few others and their families. But what's interesting is that Moses records that he said, the Spirit of God, right? And he said, God hath showed. And the word that he used is El. And El, into the Hebrews, is the one true God. But El, to the Canaanites and many of the Semitic Mesopotamians, was the most high God of their pantheon of gods. So whether or not they worshiped the real, true God, the title of El would have been applied to their king of the gods if they were Mesopotamian or Levantian Semites. Remember, when Abram met Melchizedek, and he is the priest of El Elyon, the Most High God. Well, to Abraham and Melchizedek, that meant our God. But to the people round about them, they would use that exact same phrase to refer to the king of their pantheon in ancient times. Okay? So, it is not absolutely vital to any scriptural truth to determine who the pharaohs are. They happened because God said these things happen, right? But Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. The 5 years of plenty go by. Lots of grain is stored up. And then the 5 years of famine come. And apparently, after 2 years, Jacob hears that there is bread in Egypt, and his servants, his children, his grandchildren are hungry. So he tells his sons, 10 of them, not including Benjamin, to go to Egypt, find the ruler of the land, and buy some corn or wheat and bring it back. And Joseph has a meeting with his brothers. And in that meeting, something interesting is going to happen. You know what it is? The first of his dreams is going to become fulfilled. Because his brothers all come in before him and bow down unto him. Right? So, chapter 42, the sons of Jacob come to Egypt during the famine to purchase grain from the governor of the land, not knowing he was their own brother. So Joseph decides to test them, and he demands that his brothers bring Benjamin back with them, until which he will be kept. He kept Simeon a prisoner. Here's an interesting question. Knowing that the Bible likes to tell stories holistically, the Hebrew custom is to tell stories in circles, right? We talked about how the death of Abraham is recorded before the birth of the twins, Jacob and Esau, but actually they were 15 when he died, right? Is it possible that Joseph doesn't know he has a little brother? Is it possible that when Joseph left, his mother was still alive and Benjamin had not been born? I think it's possible. I don't think it's certain, and I think you could make an argument for both sides of that possibility. But it would be really interesting either way, right? Either when he left, Benjamin was a young child and he misses him, right? Or he's never heard of Benjamin and he wants them to prove he exists, right? So he decides to test them in any case by saying, go get your brother and bring him back to me. That's chapter 42. And then chapter 43. Let me get to where I can move. Joseph's brothers return again when they run out of food and bring Benjamin with them. Why did they wait so long? Because Jacob refused to send Benjamin, right? Jacob didn't want to let Benjamin go because if he thinks of Rachel as his only true wife, which is actually the opposite of true, Leah is his only true wife. Rachel married an already married man who was not even divorced, right? But he thinks of Leah as his one true wife, his true love, and he has one remaining child to be the heir with her. And he is loath to put Benjamin at risk. But they refused to go back without Benjamin because they were told not to, right? It's a waste of a trip. It could be dangerous. He might even kill us, but he's certainly not going to give us any food if we show up without Benjamin. So they go and they take Benjamin with them. So now Joseph wants to find out if his brothers have really changed, right? So in chapter 44, Joseph decides to set them up. First, he feeds them a great meal, and they're talking amongst themselves, and they have no idea that he understands every word that they're saying because he's always speaking Egyptian in front of them and using an interpreter to talk to them, right? And he's all dressed up in the royal regalia, and it's been quite a while since they last saw him, 13 years before he stood before Pharaoh. Then 7 more years went by for the famine, for the plenty, right? So 13 plus 7 is 20, and then 2 more years went by into the time of the famine. So think about it. It's been 22 years. Do any of you look different than you did 22 years ago? You might be recognizable to a sibling, but if you haven't seen that sibling and don't have Facebook, and they're all dressed up in the robes of a foreign land, and they're not where you expect them to be, you probably wouldn't recognize them. Right. That's a very un-Semitic thing to do, right? They didn't recognize him. So he decides to give them another test. He puts every man's money back in their bag the same as he did last time, but this time he adds his special chalice, the one that he uses for divining, and that probably means exactly what you think. Joseph, though a prophet of God and though a great-grandson of Abraham, is doing divining in a witchcrafty sort of way for the Pharaoh of Egypt. I don't know what to make of that. I'll leave you to ponder it on your own time because I have no idea why or how. But Joseph tests his brothers by putting his sacred cup into the bag of his little brother Benjamin. And he's the perfect patsy. Because he wants to see if they will give away Benjamin's life like they gave away his. So, Benjamin is accused of stealing. The men chase them down. They bring them all back. They stand before Joseph, their brother, but now in judgment. And he says, I told you, you're all a bunch of thieves. And now you've proven it. So I'm going to take your brother and he will be a slave and you are all free to go. And who steps up? Who's the one who says, I will not let this happen again? It's not Reuben. It's not Simeon, right? It's not Levi. It's the fourth son of Jacob and Leah. It's Judah. Because this has been Judah's story all along. And the entire story of Joseph is to bring us to this moment where it's time for Judah to have a crisis of conscience and to prove that he has grown. So in chapter 44, they leave the house and they're on their way And all of a sudden, they get tracked down and they get in trouble. And who is it that speaks for them? Verse 18, then Judah came near unto him and said, O my Lord, let thy servant, I pray thee, speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not thine anger burn against thy servant, for thou art even as Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servant, saying, Have ye a father or a brother? And we said unto my Lord, We have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, a little one, and his brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother, and his father loveth him. By the way, Joseph is now 39 years old, and his brother is a little one. That's why I'm not sure they had ever met before. And thou saidst unto thy servants, Bring him down unto me, that I may set mine eyes upon him. And we said unto my Lord, The lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. And thou saidst unto thy servants, Except your younger brother come down with you, ye shall see my face no more. And you skip down all the way and get to the nub of the matter. And he says in verse 30, Now therefore, when I come to thy servant my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life, it shall come to pass, when he seeth that the lad is not with us, that he will die, and thy servants shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, If I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. So, I want you to think about the dichotomy of this juxtaposition of events. It was 22 years earlier, Judah saying to his brethren, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery. Let's get some money out of the deal, right? And besides, we wouldn't want to shed the blood of our own brother, not when we can get paid, right? And Joseph remembers. But now he hears Judah pleading for the life of Benjamin. And he knows, because Joseph is not stupid. He knows that the sons of Leah have the most to lose if Benjamin lives and remains at home, right? Because if both of the sons of Rachel are gone, well then either Reuben or one of the other sons of Leah will be the heir. But yet Judah handles this situation completely different. Look at the dichotomy of this juxtaposition. Now Judah is on his knees begging for the life of Benjamin. Chapter 45. Joseph can't take it anymore. And he calls out to all of the Egyptian servants and leaders of the court and Hyksos people who might be present, all of you out. Out. You can almost imagine that the guards are like, you want us to leave you alone with these dudes? And he's brooking no argument. Everybody leaves. He's alone. And while he's alone with his brethren, he says those words, I am Joseph. Now, I want you to imagine that you are Judah, you are Simeon, you are Levi, you are Asher, and you hear the words come out of the mouth of the vizier of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and you're in Egypt. I am Joseph. What reflex do you have in that moment? Yeah. In the world, right? Yeah. Yeah. Where are you going to run to, right? Yeah, but remember who's on the other side of the door. That's where Joseph sent the guards, right? Yeah. So picking up, right. So picking up here, um, Joseph's brothers return again. Joseph tests his brethren, and then below chapter 44, we get to 45. After his brothers pass the test, because Judah, the same brother who suggested selling Joseph to the others 2 decades before, offers to die for Benjamin, Joseph reveals his true identity and offers to care for the whole family during the famine. Jacob and all his clan journey to Egypt when he is 130 years old, chapter 47, verse 9, 216 years after Abram came to Canaan, chapters 46 and 47. Jacob dies and is buried in Canaan in the tomb of the patriarchs, chapters 48 through 50. And before we begin the before we begin the book of Job, we're going to look at the eschatology section of Genesis, Genesis 47 through 50, the last 6 chapters. So I will see you guys tomorrow, and we will finish Genesis and get into Job. Sure.